the personalized invite link that I got.
It's in her mind. Okay, well, we know Sarah should be joining shortly, so as time is short and we see some people filtering into the room, I think we can go ahead and get started. So welcome everybody to today's session on big data and transit equity. We are really excited to take on this timely set of topics all at once. And we have a quite stacked lineup of experts here from nonprofit, from academia, from government and private sector, and each of them have moved between different sectors. So we are excited to welcome them all at once. So by way of some introductory framing remarks, I'd like to go ahead and share a few slides. And those are coming up right now. Great. So big data and transit equity, new questions. So we want to start off with a land acknowledgement. We sit on the unceded lands of the Massachusetts and Wampanoag. We honor the land itself, the people who continue to act as its stewards, and the cultural traditions they sustain today. And in recognition that not all of us, or even most of us, are located in the land now called Massachusetts, we want to point you to some resources to help you learn about the native lands that you inhabit, as well as flag the ongoing work of these tribes and these peoples. So with that, we'll move into the substance of our presentation, which is that transportation equity has never just been about transportation. From Rosa Parks' refusal to give up her seat to the Freedom Riders trip across the South, to the Selma March across the Edmund Pettus Bridge, many of our most impactful moments in our nation's civil rights history, at least in the US context, have unfolded in transportation spaces. At the same time, we know that the construction of transportation infrastructure has brought destruction and violence on both an individualized scale in the form of police violence and auto violence, as well as on a structural scale. The construction of highways has destroyed Black neighborhoods from coast to coast. And at the same time, or more recently, I guess, these same spaces have been reclaimed by the Black Lives Matter movement and other activists to reassert their right to the city and their power and their voice. So what we're saying is that transportation infrastructure is full of history context. It is anything but neutral, and inform today's discussion on data. Often in cheerful graphics like this one, it is suggested to us that Black, Indigenous, and people of color are the prime beneficiaries of new mobility technologies, mobility as a service, the Internet of Things, and other such technologies. And we see these themes also play out in the public discourse. Some planners are cautiously optimistic, suggesting that data is a tool for equity and inclusion. Others go further and suggest that data is comprehensive, that it can capture the totality of transportation equity and be a tool for it. But in the context of structural racism, as we talk about throughout this conference, a critical question to ask is who wins when a city gets smart? And so this is our starting point for today's discussion on big data and transit equity. And without further ado, I'd like to panel. I'm lucky to have each of them, and I will pass it first to Ambar Johnson to introduce yourself. Before we get there, I just want to clarify that we are looking at the chat and collecting questions, and we're going to leave about 10 minutes at the end to take those on. So please feel free to drop those in. We are looking, and we are excited to hear what you have to say. But Ambar, please take it away.
And thanks to everyone for being here. And of course, thanks to Hindsight for allowing us to talk about this. Before I get into the details of who I am, I just want to be mindful for introductions that we, of course, say our pronouns and try to give a visual description for those who might have different needs in terms of attending this session. So Hi, everyone. My name is Ambar Johnson. I use she, her pronouns. I am dark skinned. I have large braids with blue and red earrings, and I'm wearing a white shirt. I'm program director at Livable Streets. I work in the Emerald Network program, which is managing 200 miles of greenways in Boston, working on transportation advocacy. And I'm thankful to be able to be here in today's session, connecting with Emmett regarding topics like this and speculative fiction and others. So thank you all for having me, and I will pass it off to Yasha, who's right next to me.
Thanks, Ambar. Hi, I'm Yasha Franklin Hodge. I use he, him pronouns. I have a olive complexion, we'll say salt and pepper hair, maybe a little gray, and facial hair, and I'm wearing a blue shirt. I am the executive director of the Open Mobility Foundation. We are a nonprofit open source software foundation that brings together cities and companies in the transportation space to develop technical mechanisms for data exchange between private sector mobility companies and the public sector that's charged with regulating those companies and managing the streets on which they operate. Prior to this role, I was a visiting fellow at the Kennedy School looking at the intersection of tech, transportation, and local policy. And before that, I was the Chief Information Officer for the City of Boston. And I will pass it off to Lily.
Great. Hi, good morning, everyone. I'm from Los Angeles, California. I use she, her pronouns, despite my SoCal and I have and yeah, and glasses. I am the interim executive director of Urban Movement Labs, a nonprofit organization based here in Los Angeles that works to facilitate collaboration between private sector mobility companies and public sector transportation agencies and departments. Prior to joining Urban Movement Labs earlier this year, I've spent most of my career working on sustainable communities from the private sector position, most recently at Lyft, from the government position, working both at the federal, state, and local levels, and then my career in transportation advocacy. So I'm really excited to bring those varying perspectives and backgrounds to the conversation today. And I'll pass it off to our final speaker, Sarah.
Hi, everyone. I'm super excited to be on this panel with all you today. I'm just super impressed with all of your work. My name is Sarah Williams. I'm an associate professor of technology and urban planning at MIT, where I also run the Civic Data Design Lab. My research lab really thinks about how we can translate data into action and use it for policy change. And that is the name of my new book, which is coming out December 10th. So I put a little, super excited about that. I've done a lot of work with mobility, thinking mostly in the framework of semi-formal transit systems. And semi-formal transit systems are kind of what most of the world has in terms of mobility in Latin America, Africa, and many parts of Asia. And we work with many cities to map out their semi-formal systems in order to provide access to those. And we have a resource center for this work in Latin America and Africa, and have been able to get almost 40 different cities into Google Maps, so you can actually find out where your semi-formal buses are going in formal maps there. And so it's super excited. The impact of our work in providing that data really allowed for increased mobility, and we believe it shows how you can turn data into action.
Thank you all. And I realized that I forgot to introduce myself at the very beginning. My name is Emmett McKinney. I am fair complexion with brown hair, wearing a blue shirt and a dark sweater. I use he, him pronouns. I just this past year graduated from the MIT Department of Urban Studies and Planning, so I was a protege and generally a stan of Sarah's. So I'm delighted to bring this conversation forward today and to continue learning. So to kick it off, one of the big questions that we're confronted with in this space is, does data direct our focus toward the most important problems? And we'll offer the first example here of sidewalk repair requests collected in the city of Boston. On the far left, you see a heat map with some red, very hot areas, both the downtown and back bay areas of the city. And those are the high frequency of requests. In the middle, you see the sidewalk conditions. Again, show a similar heat map, but you can see that the poorest, the most distributed throughout the city. And then again, on the far right, you see a heat map of per capita income with the red area showing high income. The requests and the income seem to be closely correlated and not so reflective of sidewalk conditions. Yasha, you brought this example up. So do you want to take the first crack at the question of, does data direct our focus towards the most important problems?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very much a cliche to say, but there's the idea of kind of what gets measured gets managed, and I think the you look at this example, and what this says to me is that if all we measured what was on the left, where people are complaining, then that would be how we allocated sidewalk resources. By checking that value by saying, hey, are we actually measuring the right thing? It gives us an ability to recognize that actually what we're treating as objective data is heavily biased towards specific audiences that feel empowered to be able to demand services for their neighborhood and who are making use of the facility that we've provided. So, I think if there's anything I take away from this these series of maps, it's that constantly be suspect of the biases that are inherent in the data that we're collecting. We have to be asking, who are these data representing? We have to be, finding other ways, other facets of the challenge that we're trying to solve, and identifying ways to measure those. To check that what assumptions we've derived from the data we have are in fact reflective of the real needs of the communities that we're trying to serve. And I think all too often, data is used to shut down that kind of inquiry, to say, okay, now we know, now let's go do. And to me, the big lesson is that inquiry should probably never end. You always need to be examining what you think you know and finding new ways to challenge that and improve the quality of that information.
Yeah, I would just add on that an important piece of this question is complementing mobility metrics and data with community feedback and ground truthing. So the data can help you better target your outreach and your communications and your conversations with the neighborhoods and communities that you're focused on. But once you get to the more granular level of understanding block by block differences or street by street characteristics that could change a project or change your interventions, I think that's really where the qualitative components of data gathering come in. In our work in LA through Urban Movement Labs, we've really found that that level of granularity is so important because LA is such a massive geographic city that you can have such neighborhood boundaries that are more community specific and don't show up on a map or on a citywide scale. And so that's been really an important finding of our work. What works in one street might not work on the next street.
Yeah, I mean, I think like also just want to say like how important it is to think about what's missing from the data. I think this slide is a helpful illustration of that. And so what data we use kind of helps guide us to important problems, but if we don't think about who or what is missing from the data, we can be guided into a direction that we might not intend, right? And so, you know, like I think that as we work with data, we always should be asking ourselves who's missing, and then when we make decisions with data, could our decisions do any harm, right? Because I think so often we focus on what the data is telling us, but we're not often thinking about the other ways that it could be misused or misinterpreted. And I feel like that's one way that we can help, like, I guess, most important problems for whom we have to ask ourselves as well.
Sure. Yeah, you know, in looking at these maps, I note that we categorize sidewalk quality with one color, but there are really many facets that go into something, right? And there are important equity implications to that. Do we care most about the sidewalk width, the availability of curb cuts for those for whom curbs are more challenging than others? Are we concerned with the relative grade of the sidewalk? There are a lot of features that go into quality that may reflect our own singular points of view.
Absolutely. It's interesting talking about those different factors that in terms of talking about data. One of the pieces of work that we were able to do at Livable Streets was going into transportation demand modeling and really thinking about all those assumptions that go into this behemoth of a model, of an algorithm, if you will, that talks about what kind of projects and decisions that are made about those projects, and realizing that a lot of the things like quality of service, political climate, all these other things about the quality of the experience writing, like those kind of things are not incorporated within data to ensure how people make those decisions or what kind of propensity they'll have to continue to make those kind of decisions on how they get around. So I'm glad that you brought up those little fine details of even like how wide is a sidewalk, because those kind of things matter when you're talking about people who are all through the built environment, which is what this is all about.
Sure, and this is where I think the bigness of data is really interesting. We talk about it as a panacea, as though we can crack a code on a system-wide scale, but when you aggregate to the level, even in a graphic such as a heat map like this, you lose some of that block by block granularity, which may actually be what we're most interested in the end.
Yeah, I would say in particular, I mean, as an example, in this case, you know, I was at the city when some of this work was taking place, and one of that kind of elements of local granularity that is not represented in this data, but is really looking at a neighborhood and what are the key transportation paths and links that exist within specific neighborhoods. And in particular, the ones that facilitate access to public transit, since every transit journey starts and ends with a walking trip. You know, really trying to analyze that, which you may have an area that has generally poor sidewalk conditions, but if you're going to decide how to prioritize resources, likely you want to focus on the most critical links in that community as a place to start in improvements. And so I think that's a great example of really, you know, as Ambar said, it's kind of getting beyond the sort of unidimensional engineering metrics and starting to ask about experiential quality and need, and listen to the community as they talk about what their priorities are, and then to figure out ways where you want to try to quantify that to build measurement systems that can capture those ideas and not simply maintain that unidimensional focus that so often engineers end up in as a result of kind of specialization and you know, particular professional focus. You're muted, Emmett.
A bus drove by earlier, speaking of local experience, and I thought that was distracting. But so I think that takes us nicely into the next question I wanted to pose, which is, does data speak to the historical roots of today's inequities? On the right, you see what many of us know as a redlining map, which was done in the 1930s by the federal government to identify areas that were high risk. We know now this risk assessment correlated closely with, in some, the race of the folks who live there, and then being a higher risk population. So this is structural racism on a map. On the left, you see a recent report from the Massachusetts Bay Transportation Authority, or the T as it's locally known, about bus delays along some of the key routes. And if you notice, a lot of the red ink shows up in similar locations on both sides, especially through neighborhoods like Roxbury in Boston. And so I want to raise this example to say, can we learn something about where we've come from the data we've seen today? And does it create new blind spots? And Ambar, I'll pass it to you first, since I know that Livable Streets has done a lot of really critical work in this area.
Give me like 2 seconds to gather my thoughts.
Sure.
There's a lot. There's a lot of different directions. You know,
I mean, oh, go for it.
No, go for it.
I was like, I'll go in and while I give Amber some time to think about it. But if you're ready, go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll just go in one direction, and I know we have a great panel, so we're going to get into it anyway. I think that the data does, or at least it depicts what's been going on. I like the slide that we just saw. How many of us have seen the same kind of slides with the same blots of where Black and brown folks live and where wealthy white communities are? I mean, if we even look at the previous map, I don't know how closely people were paying attention, but where there was inequity or like the need for sidewalks to be rebuilt, there was kind of like an inverse correlation between those who had higher incomes who felt even more obligated or felt more empowered, if you will, to get those changes that they need need. So going back to the next slide, like I think that there's so much packed into the landscape, especially within these maps and history. I think a lot of the times we know exactly what's going on with these historic implications. And I think that to a lot of the times to the point that what is depicted in parts like gaslights communities, because people keep saying what needs to happen, or this entity or this city isn't listening to what we are saying. And then folks who are in here who are planners, I was a planner, I still am a planner, but I worked as a consultant in the past, can speak to these kind of things where they have to assuage all these different relationships, but at the end of the day, it's like they're not wrong, they being the community. Like there are things in terms of gaps in our political systems, and even who is able to advocate and who is not, like areas that have like paid advocates and folks who are like legitimately grassroots, who have jobs and families to take care of and do not get paid to be an advocate. So anyway, all of that to say, I think it speaks to them, but I think that there's a lot of these things in terms of like the quality and the experience and the trauma that's involved with those things that gets divorced with all the colors that get on the map. And I think at times, though people get really excited about data and showing new ways to tell these stories visually, because that's what gets people to move into action, I do believe that too many of the times we get stuck there in the visualization or like the creation of the maps and saying all these things, to the point that I don't think that we realize that we are kind of playing games with people's lives and saying, look at this really pretty thing that I created, this is what's happening, and then it just ends there and no action is taken forward. So I do think it speaks to them, but I am weary, and I'm gonna go back and watch the session that's going on right now about decentering whiteness in planning, because I think this kind of speaks to that in terms of data and the historic roots of the inequities that we're presenting. Even when it comes to modeling, I think that sorry, like my brain right now is like, but I think what we really need to do is have practitioners and officials who start to take action. There are so many times that we've done the data-driven approach, we've done the story-driven approach, we have libraries and all this wealth of information in books because history in itself is data. And I'm afraid that we're in a place now where people are more interested in acquiring the information and holding it and knowing what is wrong, but not doing anything about changing the material realities of the people who we are supposed to be serving. And instead, in some instances, serve ourselves with our skills that we're presenting. So yeah, that's what I have to say for now about that. And what I'm excited about, especially in the work that we are doing in terms of like questioning our modeling systems and making sure that we're on track to actually change material realities using data and making sure people are going to action, where we hope to like make people understand those dissonances between what is presented, like we see in our report, and the actions that people take in terms of what projects get developed. And where, as we saw with the previous slide, where sidewalk changes, something simple as like sidewalk changes are happening.
Great, thank you, Ambar. Sarah, did you want to jump in?
You're muted.
Sarah, you're muted.
I thought I'd unmute.
We'll get this down.
Yeah.
You know, like I think like kind of what Ambar was saying is, you know, any medium that we use as representation holds the biases of those that use it. So just like pen on a page or an image or, you know, data represents the biases of those. So like, you know, of course, like much of the data that we see represented, it does both represent inequities or hold within it inequities, but also very much traces past inequities established or marked on the landscape. And one of the things this makes me think a lot about is I write a lot about the history and use of data as a tool of oppression, and particularly a tool of technocratic planners to push and marginalize populations. And data was something very much that they used to employ that. And so much of the highway movement and the destruction of whole communities use data as evidence for that work. And so when you see a map and you see a highway running through a community, it very much does trace back those kinds of histories. And so yes, and so I think it's nice that you brought it up, because I think we should always be asking ourselves, how might the data that we're using, and I go back to what I said earlier, how might the data that we're using reflect those same inequities, right? And how can we actually work to change it? So rather than to say, and I really liked what Ambar had to say about this was, you know, that to like, let's really change those inscriptions on the landscape to be something different, or kind of reimagined.
Just maybe pulling a couple of threads together from both Ambar and Sarah's points. I mean, I think something that I observed as a city technology official and still see is this tendency to look to technology in an attempt to make what are challenging political decisions somehow easier or free of political friction. And the term I would always use for this is kind of smart washing, right? When you take something that is fundamentally a political power question or an equity question, try to wrap a bunch of technology around it in the hopes that that really hard thing of confronting privilege and correcting past injustice is somehow going to not be hard or not be painful or not be a political challenge if you have enough data about it. And you know, I think anyone that's looked at history in this space can tell you that's not true, right? Data does not make, these are real fundamental needs that require real political courage and meaningful engagement. And so I think just being cognizant of that, the way that technology can make things seem like they're not political is a really important part of kind of addressing this. The other piece that I would say is there's this sort of, and this gets to kind of Sarah's point about the biases that are implicit in the kind of systems of measurement and data gathering. I think there's a tendency on the part of technologists, and I say this as somebody with a background as a software developer and a you know, system designer, that like there's a tendency to think about things as optimization problems. It's sort of like, oh, with enough data, we can find the optimal solution. And inevitably, when you start to think about something as complex as a city and the lives of the people who live in it as something that can be optimized, you're imparting your bias and your worldview about priorities into whatever system you build to try to achieve that optimization. You know, are you optimizing? I mean, that's the example that was given of sort of that Ambar gave earlier about, you know, performance metrics for roads, right? We talk about level of service. That's level of service for people in cars, not for people on foot or on a bicycle. You know, we build these sort of optimization tools that, again, have that veneer of technocratic neutrality, but ultimately are really a collection of prioritization decisions that we've you know, embedded inside of a technical solution. So I think that kind of just even moving away from the language of optimization and recognizing that there are always going to be conflicting perspectives on priority and conflicting value sets that exist in any context where you're talking about planning or city design or decisions about you know, infrastructure, and leaning into those tensions rather than trying to make them disappear under a sheen of data is the right way to approach it.
Yeah, this is Lily. I would just totally echo what you just said. I think a lot of cities are, I think that's a great way of framing data washing or smart city washing difficult political decisions. I wanted to just double or echo what you were saying about I think that the tendency in the transportation industry is particularly strong on that sort of technocratic planning because it is a industry grounded in civil engineering, and the number crunching and the metrics and analytics and optimization is sort of like the legacy that we're all working in. And what this conversation is really showing is the movement that I think are in the middle of, from a transportation planning paradigm that says we recognize, you know, 1.0 version would be like, we recognize the historic disparities in our systems, but we planners and transportation officials have the answer. And the answer in your community is smart growth, it is bike lanes, it is, you know, this laundry list of things that we've determined are appropriate. And I think where we are now is shifting towards a sort of 2.0 version of that, which is using data to ground truth and then have difficult conversations or conversations with the community around what do you see and what do you need. And then where we're headed is making sure that we follow through as planners and city officials to deliver on what we've discussed. So I think a lot of communities have said, you know, we've heard for 20, 30 years that you're going to fix my sidewalk or put in a street light. And I don't want to talk about roundabouts or bike lanes until we get that core infrastructure right.
Is a perfect segue. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. That is a perfect segue to the next piece, which is who gets to tell their story with data. The left, you see a project of the Anti-Eviction Mapping Project that map evictions relative to the Google bus stops in San Francisco. And on the right, you see another counter mapping project done in 1971 showing where Black children had been run over by white commuters in Detroit. And this gets to the question of who gets to be represented. And because we are a little bit short on time, I want to at the same time raise the next question, which is that how can data bring communities closer and not push them away? I think these work together, so maybe we can take them both on at once.
It's funny. I guess I'll kind of go to the last question, weaving in the first. How can data bring communities closer and not push them away? In my time when I was working as a transportation planner in Atlanta and even doing advocacy as like a planner with livable streets, one of the things I think is so funny about this work and those that we work with is that and that I think goes unsaid a lot of the times when we're talking about advocacy or any kind of work really, is that for me at least, I know proximity to praxis is important. So the way I became a planner, I didn't even know about planning. I never owned a car, I still don't own a car, but transportation has always been a part of my life. And when I was going to all these different places, working on these different projects, I noticed that really I was sometimes the only person working from my community, in my community, whereas all the other planners are from the neighborhood that they gentrified. So they were able to like buy into the place that is now their community. So they're literally planning their own communities. You have folks who are, really good friends with those who are in political positions, who are also planners. And there's all these invisible things that are happening in the forces of relationship building, who people go to school with, who has access to planning, all these kind of things with relationships, which of course are not objective. And kind of going back to what Yasha mentioned earlier about having data and these decisions disappear under the sheen of data as if all these things are objective. But that part just doesn't get talked about at all, about like who are planners and who are the planners within your neighborhood who are able to get things going, So I think that talking about that part and making sure that instead of community members being treated as subjects, who are under the control or the vision of other planners, what does it look like for community members to plan their own communities, just how a lot of planners are able to plan their own communities, So, and a lot of the work that we're doing at Livable Streets with our Street Ambassadors program that we have, and the way in which we've been doing outreach ensures that there is community voice like along the way. Like we are trying to be a mediator between these things. So communities are able to use those planning skills and we just facilitate. Sometimes that's the translation of all the planning jargon, which does not have to be that hard because it really isn't, and ensuring that you don't need to have a degree in order to make a difference in your life and in your community. So I feel as if, of course, like really being very open and transparent about this. And I really want planners to do that as well. Like realize that, yeah, even if you're not a particular planner in your community is made up of planners. So of course, like you're getting the things in which you want. And I really want people to be honest about that, whether like internally within themselves or even the groups that they're working with. Because just imagine if all those areas that we saw before in our map, like let's say places like Roxbury and Mattapan, like if people were able, who were planners, if they were able to have access to planning jobs or the same amount of access to tools and resources and people, maybe the infrastructure would look different. So that's one of my takes on that question.
Sarah, you're muted if you're speaking.
Looks off mute on my screen. I have a lot of thoughts about this. One of the things that I talk about in the second chapter of my book is how collecting data together from a community perspective actually creates more community. And I guess one example I was like wrote about in the book is like, you know, doing citizen science projects where you collect air quality data, or even like collecting information about the oil spill when it happened in Louisiana, brings groups of people together around an issue. And maybe it's not as important how accurate the data is, but the fact that they're trying to create evidence and you know, advocate for their position actually helps bring them together and create that kind of community around a shared idea or shared vision. So I think in ways, and we do this in transportation data too, but I definitely would say like the work that we did in Nairobi to collect data on the semi-formal transit system created a community around advocacy for the matatus, which are the system, created kind of and built a different type of community. And so I think data definitely can help bring people together in a way, and actually share their position rather than from the top, but from their vantage point.
I would maybe invert this a little bit and say, you know, if what you want is outcomes that really serve a community, maybe don't start with data, right? Start with bringing the community together, right? Start with how do you engage different members of the community who will inevitably want to engage differently depending upon who they are and you know, their cultural context, their comfort with technology, their you know, level of sort of feeling of buy-in and voice in the civic process, right? There's not going to be one process of community engagement that works for everyone in the community. And when we define the mechanisms of engagement in ways that are so limited that they can only serve some particular subset of the community, we are intrinsically introducing bias into the planning and the design process. I think if you start by asking that question of how do we get maximal breadth in our community engagement, then you can layer in the question of what data can we gather in those processes that we develop, which can be useful and informative in the planning that then takes place as a result of this. And so, you know, I'm thinking about things like when I go in my community on neighborhood walks where we look at transportation issues in the neighborhood, and the level of sort of fine-grained knowledge and information that people are able to impart verbally. You know, they can point to that one intersection and that one corner and say, you know, I keep almost getting hit here because this thing happens, right? Like, that is really useful data. It is not necessarily sort of, you know, a quantifiable sort of, you know, percentage of times somebody is almost hit, but you capture enough of those insights and they actually can really serve the process in meaningful ways. And so I think, you know, thinking about, okay, what can you layer in there? Can you use digital maps as a way to collect that kind of local insight? Can you, you know, can you do surveys? Can you use the process of a walk or a ride along or a community outreach process like street ambassadors to start to produce a little bit more quantifiable information about what the community's experience is? But make sure you're centering it in that community process, not in a data gathering exercise.
I want to add to that, Yasha, because you said that so well. One of the things we were able to do at Livable Streets, we talked to the residents along a really busy corridor here in Boston, and we were able to just chat with folks, and they were able to tell us specifically what intersections were their most problem areas, and we were able to get all of those different needs and deliver those to the city and say, hey, this is a short-term improvement list that you can get started on today, you know? So I definitely agree, and I just wanted to echo that.
Yeah, this is Lily. I'll just add, and maybe this will segue to the last section, which is, if I could paraphrase a little bit, what we're saying is to not use data to drive towards a solution, but use data to set the table for a conversation with the community. And whether or not that's a conversation that, you know, the community participates in the data collection or validates some findings or has some other way of interacting with data to contribute to it, I think that is a key sort of learning from what we're trying to highlight here. Yeah, I know go ahead, Emma. You're on mute. This system.
Well, I think Sarah and I have fused our brains in this session. So anyways, this can move us on to the last question, which is how can data spark action for equitable mobility systems? Sarah, you alluded to your work in Nairobi with digital matatus and your informal planning work. Do you want to talk about how these analyses that we've talked about become real change in the built environment?
Great. I guess I mentioned a little bit about the work that we did in Nairobi, but I think one of the things that I think was important about the data gathering work that we did, so as I mentioned, we collected data to map the Matatu system, which is the informal transit system, but in the process, we invited all the stakeholders to participate with us. That includes the government, as well as the Matatu drivers and owners, and other transit stakeholders, open data. And I think what's important about doing that when we work on data collection is that everyone trusted the data and the process that we went through to collect it. And through that trust, we created kind of a new community, but we also allowed an extension of that work to be done in that instantly the city trusted it and used it to help improve transportation models. But the Matatu drivers and owners also trusted it and trusted the representations. And so I think creating that trust in data is a super important in to creating this action, because each one of those actors will take it and do their own type of work with it, right? And so how can we ensure both the government and the Matatu drivers are using a data set that allows them to do the best work that they need to do for the city? I also think, and this gets back to some of the points that I'm seeing in the chats, is that not everyone has access to use data and to operate with it and to play around with it. And I think visualizing it becomes a really important component to the work that we do in order to take it into action. So how do we communicate the insights with data to maps? And when we talk about the open data movement, I think very much data visualization is an aspect of that. How do we communicate data to multiple publics so that they can take those insights and work with them? So if they might not have some kind of data literacy, at least they have an understanding of what the insights say and can use it to have their own impact. And so one of the things that I think is really an important component to using data for action is being able to communicate that ethically and responsibly for all groups.
One quick thing that I'll add with this, it's boring in terms of action. But one of the things that we got as a result from the study that we were able to do on transportation models and how those they inform decision making, wish we can go more into that, but that's another time. But one of the things that we thought would be interesting is that one thing that could be helpful in terms of calibrating this thing is what if sadly, like there's not as much asset management that goes along in terms of our infrastructure and even our data for it, right? So what would it look like for DOTs or other city agencies or agencies were able to do before and after counts of construction site of certain infrastructure projects, and compare those to whatever the model projected to what the actual reality is, you know? So like little things like that, that is not as engaging. And of course, we would think through that with those agencies of what does that look like, but things like that to help calibrate things rather than trying to change everything all at once can help us along the way.
I just totally echo that. I forget what city, I won't mention what city it is, but their transportation demand, their travel demand model had been around since the 60s and was overestimating auto use by 5 to 10% every year for 60 years, and had never been recalibrated to better reflect accurate travel demand. And yet the city department was still like using this model as their source of truth. And so 100% going back to see what actually happened is so critical when you're using data to make decision making.
With our remaining few minutes here, I want to make sure that we get to some audience questions. One question that just came up that I think is really good is, what have been some of the most useful tools to help with data understanding for community members? If we're going to go communicate it, how do we actually package that data in a way that is inclusive and not deterrent?
I'll just quickly, when I, in a previous role, worked on the Los Angeles Vision Zero plan, we did a lot of community meetings on the high injury net corridors with community members, and we used a variety of formats to help people understand. So, or to provide input, depending on what format made the most sense to them. So we had physical maps that people could draw on and like highlight troublesome intersections or areas where they had hard time crossing. We had 3D like Legoland kind of versions that people could like visualize in 3 dimensions as well. And then we also had rendering, so photo rendering. So if you couldn't really picture what that intersection looked like, you could look at this photo and sort of say, ah, yes, here's what I don't like about that intersection. So having those different kinds of ways to interact with data, I think can be really helpful for people who might not understand or be able to see a map and be able to interact with it in the same way.
Something that we started to do at the city of Boston, and this project kind of realized the potential that's there, but we started to work with our public library system to build a curriculum around data and a curriculum for librarians to help them navigate some of the city's open data sets and to help make that information accessible to people who had questions or who, you know, frequently where you go is you go to the library and there's somebody there who's helpful and can, you know, help you navigate the resources available to you. But I think, you know, thinking about the existing channels that we have for translating complex topics into digestible information and knowledge for people, and the resources that exist in those in our communities, like libraries, like schools, and giving them the tools to integrate data into their curriculum and their offerings is, I think, an important step. Frankly, we should be taking at a societal level, but can be potentially particularly valuable when you're thinking about public data and information, where there is a nexus between, you know, publicly operated library services and you know, much of the transportation data and planning that's happening in city government.
I'll just add quickly, I forgot to mention, we didn't do this for the Vision Zero project I was just talking about, but I think as we've done in this conversation, starting data conversations by acknowledging historic bias and racial decision-making, particularly in transportation projects, can be such a powerful way to start that conversation around data by centering it on the history in the past before turning to the future. And I'm sure others have thoughts on that too.
Lily. With that, it just makes me think we do so much future planning as planners, right? That with all this data, we just get so lost in the future. We just neglect even the present, like what's happening now and what's happened before to lead to that. So thanks for bringing that up too.
We lose
We
Emmett.
lost our moderator.
Yeah, I think we lost our moderator. But you all have. Oh, okay, he's back.
There he
I want
is.
to resume with duties.
We were
I
about
mean,
to
you got
go
lost in the
rogue without our
matrix.
moderator.
You got lost in the data matrix.
And Sarah, there's a request for what is the name of your book again?
Oh, my book is called Data Action, Using Data for a Public Good. Thank you for highlighting that, Lily. I'm so excited it's coming out. It's been a long time making. So it's out December 1st. So we're only just a few weeks away.
Yeah, and I'm not sure if Emmett can go to the last slide on his screen, but he had prepared a list of resources and links that have, we all provided input into. So if not here, then on the chat or something, there's a lot of resources folks are sharing to continue this conversation. And Sarah, I think we'd all like some commission on their book sales, which are going up in the chat.
I know, definitely. You guys should all get a copy for sure.
Awesome. I wonder if, Emmett, are you able to wrap us up or?
I see there's one more question. Are we able to get to it?
Yeah.
It's for Sarah.
Okay. We did include the police, and you are right. They are very problematic. I'm not sure that we included them as a decision maker per se. Well, one thing to know is that half the matatus are owned by the police, by policemen. So they're both like owners, and then there's other ways that they engage within the matatu system. But I think more that we wanted the data to be trusted. I think that some countries that we work in, I'm not sure, opening the data up is would be good for them, let's say the semi-formal transit system, because it could be used against them. I would say in Nairobi that's not the case in terms of, because the police are so interwoven in this very strange way, in that they're owners of the system, but then because they're owners of the system, they also try to enforce and push out other owners using their power. Anyways, the matatu system is a complicated and interesting, but we did try to include everybody in the building of the data set.
Emmett, are you able to hear us and see us now? No? Okay. Well, sorry about that snafu, but I did get a direct message from Emmett and said he wanted to share some acknowledgements, which are on the screen. Hopefully, if there's a link, we could possibly share it out into the chat box. But if not, it's 2:30, which is the end of our session. Thank you to our phenomenal panelists for this very engaging discussion. I've learned a lot. I have a lot of quotables, which I will be tweeting out. And thank you all to those who are in attendance who've asked questions. And there is a message in the chat that our last session today will begin at 2:45. So take a break, get some tea, maybe a little snack, and see you back here at 2:45. So thank you all for your time and sharing your expertise.
Thanks, you guys. It was great chatting with you today.
Fantastic. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Yeah, we have to do this again. How do you hang up this link?